In this video, I will introduce the basics of the one-way analysis of variance, or ANOVA. We use an independent sample t-test when we want to compare the mean of a variable between two groups in a sample. We use a one-way analysis of variance when we want to compare the mean of a variable between three or more groups in a sample. The one-way ANOVA tests the null hypothesis that there is no difference in means between the groups. The test statistic for the independent samples t-test is the t-statistic. The bigger the t-statistic, the lower the probability that the null hypothesis is true. The test statistic for the ANOVA is the f-statistic. Similar to the t-statistic, the bigger the f-statistic, the lower the probability that the null hypothesis is true. The f-statistic is calculated by dividing the mean square variation between distributions by the mean square variation within distributions. Rather than going into detail about how to calculate the mean square, in this video, I'll give a conceptual overview of the f-statistic. The numerator is the mean square variance between distributions. The larger this variance, the greater the f-statistic, and the less likely the null hypothesis of no differences is true. This figure shows the means of our three distributions. The more spread or variation there is between the means, the more confident we are in rejecting the null hypothesis and saying there are real differences between the means and the underlying population. The less spread there is between the means, the less confident we are in rejecting the null hypothesis. The denominator of the f-statistic is essentially the variation within distributions. This figure shows each group's distribution around the mean. If the total variation increases, this means there's more overlap between the distributions. With this extra variation and greater overlap between the distributions, we're less confident that there's a difference between the group's means and the underlying population. If the total variation decreases, this means there's less overlap between the distributions. With less variation and less overlap, we're more confident that there's a difference between the group's means and the underlying population. To summarize, the larger the f-statistic, the less likely it is that the null hypothesis is true. In other words, the larger the f-statistic, the smaller our p-value is going to be. The more difference there is between our sample means, the more confident we will be in rejecting the null hypothesis. The less spread there is in the group's distributions, the more confident we will be in rejecting the null hypothesis. Just like the t-test, the one-way ANOVA is not always correct to use in every situation. The accuracy of the one-way ANOVA results are based on a few important underlying assumptions. The most important assumptions are generally the same as the t-test. The first assumption is that the variable of interest is a continuous variable. ANOVA is not appropriate for categorical variables. The second assumption is that the variable's distributions are normal. The third assumption is that the variance or standard deviation of each group's distributions are roughly equal.